So content review. The first category is fundamental planning knowledge, 25%. And so at the beginning of each of our sections, we highlight the key resources that we found very helpful as we were creating this presentation. The key recommendations from the list are the planning theory for practitioners, the local planning contemporary principles and practice, and there's a link here, the timeline of American planning history. And right now this link is from the Texas planning chapter. Thank you, Richard. This is a timeline that was on the APA's website for several years. It disappeared for some reason, but we like to keep showing it because it is a fantastic resource for all things historical, planning pioneers, planning movements, all in bullet point format. It's probably 8 or 9 pages. 11 pages. I was close. 11. I'm Canadian, so metric, little conversion, but yeah. But yes, just a fantastic resource, and we can't recommend it enough. And once again, the link here is at the bottom of the screen. This slide here briefly talks about the history of planning. This is a graphic indicating a timeline. You may see questions that deal with different types of planning over time. What were the pros and cons? What were the initial benefits of developments? What things worked? What didn't? What were the planning first? We've got here all the way back to the ancient foundations, Greece and Rome, for example, moving into colonial America. You know, you might be asked, what was the first city in America with a port? Or why did Boston become a major city in the colonial period? Beginning of U.S. planning, village of Riverside. Does anybody know what the first is of Riverside, Illinois?
Suburb?
Correct. Considered by many to be the first suburb. It seems to be on the exam, we typically hear that the question deals with what is the first suburb in America with curvilinear streets. Of course, that would be Riverside. If you look at a graphic or an aerial, it actually follows the contour of the land and the river. So just to know the highlights of these type of important developments. Pullman, Illinois, Forest Hills Garden, another example. We move into the beginning of modern planning, and there's a lot of planning movements and books in this area. We've listed here a lot of reforms. There's the sector theory by Homer Hoyt, multiple nuclei model I'll talk about in a couple minutes. The Sun Belt migration began in the 1950s. Does everybody know what was the reason or what was the main reasons for a lot of the growth in the South in that time? Yep, the invention of the air conditioner. So you might hear questions like that. And then the last slide here on the timeline is modern planning, new urbanism from the 1980s. An example is Celebration, Florida, smart growth, and LEED in the 2000s. Just some examples of things to be familiar with in the timeline. A lot of this is on that 11 pages that we talked about a couple minutes ago. History of the American Planning Association. So the APA, it's their exam. They get to ask whatever they want. I guess I would do the same. I'd ask questions about myself if I was in charge of an exam. So these are just 5 main points to be familiar with. You are likely typically to see something like this. 1909, the first National Conference on City Planning, which happened in Washington, D.C. You may be asked the date, you may be asked the town. Another example here is the 1917, the American City Planning Institute was renamed the Institute of Planners in 1939, and it was created in 1917. In 1934, the American Society of Planning Officials was created, and in 1978, they both merged to form the APA. So that's something that I would be very familiar with. And then the last one is in 1999, they created the College of Fellows to recognize distinguished individual contributions. Here's some examples of planning first. And by the way, these are the questions that you can memorize, but it's also an area where you're likely to see some really random questions. So some of these on the actual exam are maybe so far out of left field it could be frustrating, but remember, every question's worth a point. You can still guess and keep moving on quickly on these. Some first, what city was the first skyscraper constructed in 1884, Chicago. Boston had the first subway. Hartford in 1907 had the first planning commission created, and the first comprehensive plan was completed in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1925. Planning movements, remember back into your college days, Planning 101, for example, about the different planning movements. Be familiar who was responsible for each movement, what were the pros and cons. The City Beautiful movement, once again, with the 1909 Plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham. The City Efficient movement, a good way to think of that is all these residents from all over the country all these visitors went to Chicago for the World's Fair. They saw these beautiful, grandiose buildings in Chicago and came back to their own towns all across the country. We're like, you know what, we need a big, grandiose building like that. We need a big city hall or a big library. And so if you think of your town, I'm sure you've got these big banks, and all of a sudden they built these large structures, and then they're like, oh, we have to maintain these. Okay. So that was the beginning of the City Efficient movement, where all of a sudden municipalities took a more hard look at finances and budgeting. Be familiar with new towns, the city functional movement, new urbanism, edge cities, and smart growth. I won't get into a lot of detail on those, but be familiar with some examples of those cities, and like I said, who is responsible for a lot of those movements. This is some examples as well as some famous planning books and authors, and there's countless. I think another good resource when you're studying is to look at the books that are recommended on your reading list. These are some of the classic books. You may be asked, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, or which of these books did Jacob Riis write? What were they about? I'm just going through the list here. You might be asked, what were some of the 5 principles of the image of the city? The Death and Life of Great American Cities by J. Jacobs. Like I said, I won't read through these, but be familiar with why they were important. You won't be shown a picture of anybody. We were just having fun and thought, well, let's go see what these planning pioneers look like. You had to have strange facial hair, I guess, for the majority of them. But these are the large planning pioneers from Burnham, Edward Bassett, Ian McHarg, Valliere, Patrick Geddes, and Paul Davidoff. Be familiar with why they are planning pioneers, why they were important to our profession. When you're studying, ask yourself, is this somebody who really made an impact on planning? And if the answer is yes, be familiar with why. And these are really some of the most important pioneers to be familiar with. Planning landmarks. The APA on their website has examples of planning landmarks. These are awards that are presented for projects at least 25 years old and are historically significant, initiated a new direction in planning, or impacted American planning cities or regions over a broad range of time. So I think it would be something to just familiarize yourself with. It lists some important plans that were created, some planning documents, and for example, we even got here the Yellowstone National Park in 1872, Central Park in 1857. Be familiar with those. It's important to note that to be asked about on the exam, you don't necessarily have to be a planner. The APA obviously recognizes a lot of people who aren't planners who really impacted our profession. The majority of these are either architects, it could be community activists. We've got Frank Lloyd Wright here, Jane Jacobs. I love the way we have her beside Robert Moses in this picture. And then Saul Alinsky as well. So be familiar with key people. They don't necessarily have to be planners, but these people really did have an impact on our profession. Influences on planning. This is something that the APA has really started to stress over the last couple of years, is that they're trying to really hit home that we should be familiar with how our decisions are made. We can't make decisions in a vacuum. We not only have to communicate with people, know how to work on a team, but also be very much aware of all the different influences that impact our decision making. So these 4 influences we list here are social influences, demographic, race, age, income, for example. What are some resources that we use as planners to get that information? Then how do we use that information? Another one is political influences. This is something that I think you probably agree with me. They don't really teach us very well in school, but boy, is this important to us as planners. To be able to navigate that political environment is very difficult, but very important, especially not only if we want to keep our jobs, but if we want to get things done. If we want to implement things, it's important to make sure that we know how to work in that environment. The third is economic influences, housing values, sales tax, tax dollars, incentives, job creation. Be familiar with all of these influences as well. How does this impact your decision if you allow a new development that's going to bring jobs to your community? Do they need incentives? Is it a good deal if you give the incentives? Does the city actually make money at the end? The last one is environmental influences. We just list here flooding, natural disasters, water, energy, and preservation. Obviously, in all of our planning decisions, we want to make sure that the environment is taken into account and make sure that we do our best to protect that environment. The next section here we just wanted to touch upon is the legal principles and decisions. Some great resources here are not just Planning Magazine, but a book called Land Use and the Constitution. APA policy guides and the amicus briefs are fantastic. Land Use in a Nutshell is a fantastic resource as well, as is, once again, that timeline of American planning history. But I think, actually, if I were you and if I was studying, I think one of the best resources right now is your phone and Google, or Wikipedia, for example. As you learn a law case, put in the name of the law case, and honestly, whatever shows up on the amount of screen on your phone is typically all the information you need to know. You need to know the date, what level of the court it went to, and honestly, in a sentence or two, it'll tell you why it was important. And that's the amount of information you need. When we were studying back in the day, I remember we had the whole full 200-page documents, and you'd get to the end like, I don't even know what's going on. But this is so much better now. I think that's the amount of detail. And also, it keeps you out of going too far down in the weeds and getting into too much of the information.
Question here, Trevor.
Oh, yes, question.
I just wanted to say that there are actually animated videos on YouTube in some of the law cases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with like pictures and.
It's not like drunk history, is it? No? No. But there are, but so you just Google famous law cases and it comes up on YouTube? Okay, that's great. I didn't know that. Thank you. Okay, there we go. Another great resource. Thank you. Be familiar with the key amendments to the United States Constitution, especially those that impact us as planners. Be familiar with the First Amendment, which of course talks about free exercise of religion, freedom of speech. Be familiar with the 14th Amendment, which is the Due Process Clause, which prohibits state and local government officials from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without legislative authorization. And then the Fifth Amendment, what deals with taking private property to be taken for public use without just compensation. Be familiar with important housing acts. We've listed some of the big ones here: the 1945 Housing Act, 1954, and 1968. On some of these slides, we have examples. For this one, we have the housing case law for Mount Laurel in 1983. And this is an example of the amount of detail that you should be familiar with. So the sentence or two description of this is that the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that all of its municipalities in the state must build their fair share of affordable housing, a precedent-setting case against racial segregation. Another area to focus on when you're studying the legal section is property rights. Be familiar with how zoning impacts property rights, and that the right to undertake land use for planning is allowed. In terms of especially zoning, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, this is something, and like I said, I don't know 100% what's on the exam, but I would say this is something you're bound to see. This is an equator question I'm almost positive of, where you want to make sure that you know the law case that gave you the property rights case to be able to do zoning power. Eminent domain, the takings issue, is addressed in the Fifth Amendment, and it reads that in part that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. A case to be familiar with is Kelo versus New London in 2005. It involved the U.S. Supreme Court, and it talked about the use of eminent domain to transfer land from one private owner to another to further economic development. This was very, very controversial. I know a lot of states enacted their own case law after this to try and not allow it to happen. And does anybody know what happened after this development, after they won out, that this could be developed? They didn't build it. Yeah, the market tanked, and as far as I know, it's just still sitting there as an empty hole. But that was the example where they were going to take private property, give it to another developer so they could create a brand new giant development. And so that was very precedent setting. Theories about planning. There's some examples here. Be familiar with these once again back in your Planning 101 days. We've got here the rational planning model, which is the one I think I see used most often, which, if you remember, essentially it's where you look at the problem, look at different solutions, identify which solution is the best way to move forward, and then actually move forward with that and have it completed. Incremental planning is small steps. Transactive is more of a face-to-face planning theory. Advocacy planning, radical planning, utopianism, and Methodism. There's going to be questions on the exam that test your knowledge of how the country was developed over time, especially from the beginning. Be familiar with the Ordinance of 1785, which was the rectangular land survey, which led to the settlement of the Western United States. These are some simple illustrations to help you remember the different types of models that you're likely to see. You may see some really simple illustrations on the examination. Like I said, you won't see a photograph and have to identify who that person is, but you'll see some illustrations like this, I think, to definitely help with your questions. The concentric zone model, of course, remember that the center is the central business district and the community grows out from that center. The sector model is loosely based upon that, but there's more of a pie shape coming out of it. In this example, we have industrial being yellow, which is so not planner, but if you look at that illustration in the middle here, can somebody just yell out why a community would build with the industrial going out from the city center in that fashion? Train? Yep. So maybe there was a train line that came through. Maybe if it's a more modern city, an expressway. Maybe even if there was a river, where there was a lot of industrial focused along the river. The last one is the multiple nuclei model. For those of us who work for a regional government agency, this is probably something you're very familiar with. Essentially, instead of one central business district, you have multiple, and that a city can basically grow out from that into different areas, depending on a lot of different factors. This one here talks about the role of transportation in shaping urban form. The APA wants us to keep in mind not only how cities were developed, but how transportation impacts that. If you think about those older European cities, they have the smaller street right-of-ways. Honestly, that's because those communities, probably when they began, where there was walking trails in between or horses. They didn't need these giant right-of-ways that we need for a lot of the suburban communities we have now. So think about how the transportation impacts that. The other thing you can do is look at your own community on Google Earth and look how much is dedicated to roads or parking lots. And the APA really wants us to get into looking at that. Is that really the best use for our communities? Does that really promote walkability? And then the amount of land allocated for transportation, like I just talked about, not only the parking lots, but also interchanges, railways, ports, and even airports. Cultural influences on the form of places. The APA will likely have questions geared towards you just having the knowledge that, you know what, us as planners, we can really make an influence on the culture of our communities. It can be used as a real benefit for promoting tourism, arts education, creating cultural districts and neighborhoods. It really creates an identity, positive image, and local pride. And it stresses historical preservation. I think that, especially after 2008, there's been a lot of pressure, I think, for planners to not only implement, but also try to make our communities unique. I think a lot of us have driven through communities, especially suburbs, where they blend together. I think a lot of communities, you know, are really take a step back and why are we special? How do we get people to stay here, to even come here to visit or to live or to open a business? And I think that we as planners can really do a great job with that. Be familiar with the relationship between your local community, state government, and the national government. For example, here in this first bullet point, we talk about that the police power is the basis for land use planning authority in the United States, and that authority is usually delegated by state governments down to the local governments, including counties and cities. The local governments are most frequently exercising their police power in land use and planning matters, and that the national and state governments set policies and statutes that planners must follow. As I talked about at the beginning, when you think about government structure, Think national. You may do things a little differently in your community. Try to think what a typical government structure would be, and there's a lot of great resources, especially in that Green Bible book, which was updated with yellow cover. They have an excellent example of what a government structure is typically created like. This here is just some highlights of that. There's typically a governing body. It may be a city council, a village board, or even a board of county commissioners, for example. And then there's also typically an appointed planning commission that typically is advisory to that governing body. There's also typically a board of adjustments or appeals, which is appointed by the elected officials, and they consider requests for variance or exceptions to the zoning code. And then last but not least, the planning staff, which supports the governing body, plan commission, and the zoning board in all of the zoning functions. Some general terminology, practices, and principles of related professions. Planners, obviously, we don't create good communities or great communities alone. The APA really wants us to make sure that we know about other communities, how they succeeded by working with other professions, and I'm going to quickly go through them here, but typically it's health professionals, which is something that's really started to pick up over the last decade, the importance of public health in our planning documents. So now we're finding ourselves working with doctors. We're finding ourselves working with nurses or people that are health specialists. Bless you. We're working with architects, especially if you're going for a LEED project, for example. It's often very helpful to have an architect on board. Attorneys, they can be on your side or they could be across the table from you. Be familiar how to work with an attorney and make sure that you can, also are familiar with engineers, which I think, especially where I work, the engineers are very important if you want to get things in your capital improvement project plan and actually get things implemented. So it's important to involve architects, engineers, realtors, which are sometimes the first line. Realtors should know about what's going on in your community to not only help their clients, but if you talk to a realtor, they can often tell you some of the greatest neighborhoods or areas of your city, or they might even be able to tell you the ones that aren't as attractive. And that'll allow you to maybe take a step back and try to figure out, okay, what can I do to help those areas? And then, so these next few slides, I'll quickly go through them. I talked about public health professions. As I talked about, there's a real strengthening between our profession and public health. We've got an example here of how Cook County Department of Public Health worked with the planners to create a healthy hotspot program. Architects, be familiar with how we work with them and how they can be collaborators on our projects. Talked about attorneys, civil engineers, realtors, landscape architects, be familiar with how they can be part of the process, especially when there's streetscaping or urban design or public parks and open space, and environmentalists, which is a really broad category here. We work with so many different types of environmental specialists. It could be biologists, scientists, or naturalists, and make sure that they're involved in the projects, especially when there's environmental focus. Natural, social, and economic systems, very much related to the influences. This is basically trying to hit home once again that be familiar with the environment and of when you make your decisions. This is the political context. As I talked about, it's important to navigate through those political waters or you'll end up with hair like me. Demographics, social trends, and then ecology and water. Health, as we've talked about, and then climate. More local governments have adopted goals, policies, and plans that address climate change, often referred to as climate action plans, and there's some great examples on the APA website. And then this slide here brings it all home for this section is the core values of planning. And this slide here just pretty much summarizes everything I've just talked about and how it all influences our area of planning and how we should make sure that we're familiar with a lot of these ideas as we go forward. Before I turn it over to Devin, a lot of that, what I just went over, there's some memorization that'll get you to move quickly through those questions to let you spend more time on the longer questions, which are typically the ethics scenario-based questions. So like I said, that PDF that's on there is a great resource for you. And I'm going to turn it over to Devin right now to talk about the next section.